The whole town was freezing, -45 degrees. The power grid collapsed, pipes burst, families huddled in homes that turned to ice within hours. But up on a hill overlooking the valley, an elderly couple in their late 70s sat peacefully by a roaring fire, completely warm. Derek Bennett had stopped expecting visitors years ago. At 78, he had made peace with the quiet. The cabin he built with his own hands sat on a gentle rise overlooking Cedar Falls, Minnesota, close enough to see the town's lights twinkling at night, far enough that those lights might as well belong to another world. From his kitchen window, Derek could watch the seasons change over the valley below. What he couldn't see anymore were the people who had once filled his life with noise and purpose. 3 children, 11 grandchildren, 54 years of marriage to the same woman who still hummed hymns while she kneaded bread, and yet the phone rarely rang. The mailbox held nothing but bills and advertisements. The people of Cedar Falls had decided, somewhere along the way, that Derek and Edna Bennett were relics. Curiosities. The old couple in the strange cabin who refused to join the modern world. That cabin's an eyesore, brings down property values. No internet, no cable, no central heating. How do they even live like that? Someone should talk to them about selling. That land would be perfect for development. Derek never responded to the whispers. He simply bought his groceries, nodded politely at familiar faces, and drove back up the hill to the home that had kept him and Edna alive through every winter for half a century. The home that was about to save 23 lives. The morning of January 14th began like any other winter morning in the Bennett cabin. Derek woke at 5:30. The bedroom was cold. They kept the wood stove banked low overnight to conserve fuel, but not uncomfortable. The wood stove in the main room still held embers from the night before. Derek added kindling first, then 2 split logs of seasoned oak, and adjusted the damper until the flames caught properly. Within minutes, warmth began radiating outward, pushing back the chill that had settled overnight. This was the rhythm of their days. Fire first, then coffee, then breakfast, then whatever work needed doing, repairs, wood splitting, preserving, mending. By the time Edna emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in the quilted robe her mother had made 60 years ago, the cabin was warm and the coffee was ready. "Cold one today," she said, settling into her chair by the window. Derek handed her a mug. "Radio says it's going to get worse. Big storm coming down from Canada." "How bad?" "Bad enough that they're talking about it 3 days out." Edna sipped her coffee and gazed through the frost-feathered glass at the town below. Cedar Falls looked peaceful from here, a postcard of small-town America with its church steeples and neat rows of houses, smoke rising from chimneys, cars moving slowly along cleared streets. "Do we need anything from town?" she asked. Derek shook his head. Pantries full, wood stacked, wells working fine. He paused, watching the steam rise from his own mug. "We could ride out a month up here if we had to. Let's hope we don't have to." But something in Derek's bones, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Vietnam, told him that hope might not be enough this time. The first warnings came on January 15th. Derek listened to the weather report on the old battery-powered radio he kept in the kitchen, the same radio his father had given him when he returned from the war. The announcer's voice carried an edge of concern that Derek had rarely heard in routine forecasts. Unprecedented polar vortex expected to bring temperatures as low as -45 degrees to the northern Minnesota region. Authorities are urging residents to prepare for possible extended power outages. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. If you have elderly neighbors or family members, please check on them now. Derek clicked off the radio and stood at the window, watching the sky. The clouds had that heavy, bruised look that preceded serious weather. Not the light gray of ordinary snow, but the deep purple-black of something far more dangerous. Edna. She looked up from her knitting. "We need to check the supplies." All of them. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Derek inspected the woodpile first. 8 cords of seasoned oak and maple, split and stacked in the covered shed he'd built 30 years ago. enough to last the entire winter and then some. The wood was dry, properly aged, ready to burn hot and clean. Next, he checked the hand pump on the well. The mechanism worked smoothly, drawing clear water from the aquifer 100 feet below. Unlike the electric pumps that served every other home in Cedar Falls, this one required nothing but muscle and patience. The root cellar held potatoes, carrots, onions, and beets from last summer's garden. The pantry shelves were lined with canned goods, vegetables, fruits, meats, and soups that Edna had preserved over the years. Bags of flour, sugar, salt, and dried beans filled the lower shelves. They could eat for months without ever leaving the property. Finally, Derek climbed the ladder to the attic and inspected the space between the two roofs. This was the cabin's secret, the thing that made it different from every other structure in Cedar Falls. When Derek built this home in 1970, he hadn't followed the plans from the hardware store or the advice of local contractors. He had followed his father. Eric Bennett had emigrated from Norway in 1932, fleeing poverty and seeking opportunity in a country that promised both. He'd arrived in Minnesota with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge in his head, knowledge passed down through generations of Scandinavian builders who understood that winter was not merely an inconvenience, but a mortal threat. In Norway, Eric had told his son, "We build for survival, not comfort, survival. Because comfort is what you feel when you're alive, and you can only feel it if you stay alive." The double roof was Eric's legacy, two completely separate roof structures, one built above the other with an 18-inch air gap between them. The inner roof, constructed of thick pine planks sealed tight against drafts, held the warmth generated by the wood stove. The outer roof, built of heavier timbers and covered with metal sheeting, caught the snow and the wind and the brutal assault of Minnesota winters. But between them, in that 18-inch gap, sat a pocket of dead air that served as insulation more effective than anything money could buy. Heat rose from the cabin and warmed the inner roof. But that warmth never reached the outer layer, never escaped into the frozen sky. It stayed trapped, held, preserved, exactly as Eric Bennett had intended. The best insulator is nothing, Eric had explained. Not fiberglass, not foam, nothing. Air that cannot move cannot carry heat away. Remember this, and you will never freeze. Derek had remembered. For 54 years, he had remembered. And now, as the worst storm in Minnesota history gathered strength to the north, he was grateful beyond words that his father's wisdom had outlived his father's body. The power went out across Cedar Falls at 2:47 a.m. on January 16th. Derek and Edna slept through it. They had no electric alarm clocks, no refrigerator humming in the kitchen, no furnace cycling on and off through the night. The only sound that might have changed was the distant hum of the town below, and that was too far away to notice. When Derek woke at his usual time and walked to the window, he saw a valley transformed. Cedar Falls lay silent and dark. No streetlights, no porch lights. No glow from windows where early risers should have been making coffee and preparing for work. The only illumination came from the pale gray sky and the snow that had begun falling sometime during the night, thick, heavy flakes that accumulated with alarming speed. Derek checked the thermometer mounted outside the kitchen window. -38 degrees, and falling. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. By noon, the temperature had dropped to -42. Derek kept the wood stove burning hot, feeding it every hour with well-seasoned oak that threw heat like a furnace. The cabin's interior held steady at 68 degrees, not luxuriously warm, but comfortable, safe, alive. Through the radio, they learned what was happening to everyone else. Catastrophic failure of the regional power grid. Utility companies estimate restoration could take anywhere from 5 to 14 days. Emergency shelters have been established at Cedar Falls High School and First Baptist Church, but capacity is limited. Residents with medical equipment requiring electricity should seek immediate assistance. Edna stood at the window, watching the town below. "They're moving," she said. "I can see people walking toward Main Street." Derek joined her. Even from this distance, he could make out dark figures trudging through the snow, bundled in whatever clothing they could find, heading toward the emergency shelters that might or might not have room for them. "Those shelters won't hold everyone," Derek said, "and if the generators fail—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Edna was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to her husband with the same expression she'd worn 54 years ago, when she'd agreed to follow him into the wilderness and build a life from nothing. "We have room," she said simply. Derek nodded. He had known, even before she spoke, what they would do. "I'll clear the path to the road," he said. "You start making soup. I have a feeling we're going to have company." The first knock came at 3:15 in the afternoon. Derek opened the door to find Tom Hendricks standing on the porch, his 3 children huddled behind him like frightened chicks. Tom's face was red with cold, his eyebrows frosted white, his whole body shaking so violently that he could barely speak. "Mr. Bennett," he managed through chattering teeth. "I'm sorry. I know we haven't. The shelters are full and our house. The pipes burst. I didn't know where else." "Get inside," Derek said, stepping aside. "All of you, now." The Hendricks children, Emma, who was 12, Tyler, who was 9, and little Jacob, who was only 5, rushed past him toward the fire. They moved like creatures operating on pure instinct, drawn to the warmth the way moths are drawn to flame. Tom hesitated in the doorway, his eyes wet with tears that threatened to freeze on his cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "Thank me by getting warm," Derek replied. "Edna's making soup. There's plenty." By nightfall, the cabin held 11 people. After the Hendricks family came Jim and Barbara Caldwell, young professionals who had built their dream home on Maple Street 3 years ago. A sleek, modern structure with radiant floor heating and smart thermostats and every convenience technology could provide. The house had dropped to 20 degrees within 6 hours of the power failure. Their 4-month-old daughter, Sophie, had started turning blue before they'd fled. Then came Mrs. Patterson, the 83-year-old widow from the post office, who had walked nearly 2 miles through the snow because she had nowhere else to go and no one to help her. Derek found her collapsed at the end of his driveway, barely conscious, and carried her inside himself. Then Danny Morrison, the 19-year-old who worked at the gas station on Route 7. He'd been at work when the power died and couldn't make it home. He arrived at the Bennett cabin wearing nothing but his work uniform and a thin jacket, his lips blue and his fingers so cold he couldn't feel them. Then Frank Wheeler, the retired sheriff, with his elderly dog Duke, because Frank refused to leave the animal behind, and the emergency shelters didn't allow pets. Derek made room for all of them. He brought out every blanket, every quilt, every pillow the cabin possessed. He fed the wood stove until it glowed, radiating heat like a small sun. Edna moved through the crowded space with kettles of soup and mugs of hot tea, making sure everyone ate, everyone drank, everyone had what they needed to survive. The cabin wasn't large, perhaps 900 square feet, including the small bedroom and the loft above, but somehow everyone fit. Children curled up on the floor near the hearth. Adults sat shoulder to shoulder on the old furniture, sharing body heat, along with the warmth from the stove. Duke the dog claimed a spot by the fire and served as a pillow for little Jacob Hendricks, who fell asleep with his arms wrapped around the animal's neck. And through it all, the temperature outside continued to drop. -44, -45, -46. The windows frosted over completely, turning the outside world into an abstract blur of white and gray. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, seeking entry, finding none. Snow accumulated on the outer roof, adding another layer of insulation to the air gap that was keeping them all alive. Inside, the temperature held steady. 67 degrees, 68 degrees, warm, safe, alive. At 9 o'clock that evening, as Edna was settling the children for sleep and Derek was adding more wood to the stove, another knock came at the door. This one was different from the others, hesitant, almost reluctant. Derek crossed the crowded room and opened the door. The woman standing on his porch was in her 50s, dressed in an expensive coat that was entirely inadequate for the conditions. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, her whole bearing that of someone whose world had just collapsed. Derek recognized her immediately. Mayor Christine Walsh, the same woman who, 18 months ago, had stood before the town council and argued that the Bennett cabin should be condemned as a public nuisance. The same woman who had called their home an embarrassment to the community and a relic that has no place in modern Cedar Falls. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Christine Walsh's composure crumbled, her face twisted with shame and desperation, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Mr. Bennett, I know I have no right to ask. After everything I said, everything I did," she swallowed hard, "but my house is gone. The pipes exploded. The walls are already icing over. I have nowhere to go. The shelters turned me away. They're only taking families with children now." Her voice cracked. "Please, I'm begging you." Derek looked at this woman who had tried to take his home, who had called him a relic, who had dismissed everything he and Edna had built as worthless and obsolete. Then he looked at Edna, who had appeared at his shoulder and was watching the exchange with calm, knowing eyes. Edna nodded once. Derek stepped aside. "Come in, Mayor Walsh," he said. "There's soup on the stove and a spot by the fire. We'll find you a blanket." Christine Walsh stumbled across the threshold, her body shaking with cold and something deeper than cold. As she passed Derek, she stopped and met his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything. I'm so sorry." "I know," Derek replied. "Get warm. We can talk about the rest later." The cabin fell quiet around midnight. 23 people had found shelter within its walls by then. More than Derek had ever imagined the space could hold, yet somehow it was enough. Bodies lay everywhere, on couches, on floors, in the loft above, curled against each other for warmth and comfort. The wood stove crackled softly, throwing dancing shadows across sleeping faces. Derek sat in his chair by the window, too alert to sleep, watching over the people who had become his responsibility. Edna lowered herself into the chair beside him, moving slowly. Her joints bothered her more every year, and took his weathered hand in hers. "Full house," she said quietly, "fuller than it's been in a long time." They sat in silence, listening to the wind outside and the gentle breathing inside. "Do you remember," Edna asked, "when we first moved here? How everyone said we were crazy?" Derek smiled faintly. "Your mother didn't speak to us for a year. She thought we'd freeze to death the first winter. We almost did, that January, when the stovepipe cracked and I had to fix it in the middle of the night." He shook his head. "I thought we were done for, but we weren't." "No, we weren't." Edna squeezed his hand. "Derek, there's something I need to tell you." He turned to look at her, concerned by the change in her voice. "I got a call last week," she continued, "from Harold." Derek went very still. Harold, their eldest son, the one who had moved to Chicago 15 years ago and slowly, methodically, erased his parents from his life, who had stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped responding to letters and messages until the silence became a wall neither side could breach. "What did he want?" Derek asked carefully. "He said he was thinking about coming to visit, for the first time in 5 years. Edna paused. "He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking, about family, about what matters." Derek stared into the fire, processing this information. "He lives in Chicago," he said finally. "The storm would have hit there too." "Yes." "Did he say where he was going to stay during the storm?" Edna was quiet for a moment. Then, "He said he was going to try to make it here, that he wanted to come home." Derek closed his eyes. Somewhere out there, in the frozen darkness, his son might be trying to reach them, might be driving through conditions that had already killed the power grid and stranded countless travelers, might be fighting his way toward a home he had rejected years ago, toward parents he had dismissed as backward and stubborn and wrong, or he might have made it to a shelter, might be safe and warm somewhere, waiting out the storm like any sensible person would. Derek didn't know which possibility frightened him more. "We should sleep," Edna said gently. "Tomorrow will be long." But Derek stayed in his chair, watching the fire, listening to the wind, and wondering if the son who had abandoned him would find his way back before it was too late. Outside, the temperature dropped to -47 degrees. Inside, the cabin held steady. And somewhere on a frozen highway between Chicago and Cedar Falls, a car pushed through the darkness, its headlights barely penetrating the swirling snow, its driver gripping the wheel with white-knuckled determination. Harold Bennett was coming home. The second day dawned gray and merciless. Derek woke before anyone else, as he always did, and moved through the sleeping bodies like a man navigating a familiar obstacle course in the dark. He added wood to the stove, adjusted the damper, and checked the thermometer outside the kitchen window. -49 degrees. He had never seen it so cold. Not in 54 years of Minnesota winters, not in his father's stories of Norwegian storms that buried villages for weeks. This was something else entirely, a cold so profound it seemed to have weight, pressing down on the world like a physical force. Through the frost-covered window, Derek could see nothing of Cedar Falls. The town had disappeared behind a wall of white, swallowed by snow that continued to fall in thick, relentless curtains. The only evidence that the world still existed beyond the cabin was the faint howl of wind and the occasional crack of tree branches surrendering to the cold. How bad? Derek turned to find Frank Wheeler standing behind him, the retired sheriff's face creased with concern. Duke padded at his heels, the old dog's joints stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. "Bad as I've ever seen," Derek admitted. "Worse, maybe." Frank moved to the window and squinted into the white void. "I've been through some storms in my time. 30 years as sheriff, you see everything. But this," he shook his head, "this feels different. It is different. How long can we hold out here?" Derek considered the question carefully. "Wood's good for 3 weeks if we're careful. Food's good for longer. Water's not a problem. The well's deep enough it won't freeze." He paused. "The question isn't whether we can hold out, it's whether the others can." Frank understood immediately. The town, the shelters will run out of generator fuel eventually, and the people who couldn't get to the shelters. Derek didn't finish the sentence. They stood in silence, 2 old men contemplating a disaster they could do nothing to prevent. "Your father built this place?" Frank asked finally. "I built it, but my father taught me how. Smart man, the smartest I ever knew." By 8 o'clock, the cabin was awake and stirring. Edna had somehow transformed the cramped kitchen into a functioning mess hall, producing oatmeal and coffee for 23 people using nothing but the wood stove and her own quiet determination. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, eating from mismatched bowls. The adults clustered in small groups, speaking in low voices, their faces tight with worry. Jim Caldwell approached Derek as he was bringing in more firewood from the covered porch. "Mr. Bennett, I need to ask you something." Derek set down the logs and straightened, his back protesting the movement. "Ask. Your roof." Jim gestured upward. "Someone mentioned it's different, that it's why this place stays warm without electricity." "That's right. How does it work?" Derek studied the younger man, mid-30s, soft hands, the kind of person who had probably never split a log or fixed a leaky pipe in his life. But there was genuine curiosity in his eyes, and something else. Something that looked like the beginning of understanding. "Come with me," Derek said. He led Jim to the small ladder that accessed the attic space, and together they climbed into the gap between the 2 roofs. The space was cold, much colder than the living area below, but not frozen. Pale light filtered through gaps in the outer roof's boards, illuminating the simple architecture that had saved all their lives. 2 roofs, Derek explained, pointing. "The inner one, here below us, is sealed tight, keeps the warm air from the stove inside the living space. The outer one, above us, takes the weather, snow, wind, whatever comes, and the gap between them, dead air. Best insulator there is." Derek placed his palm against the inner roof's surface. "Feel this. Warm, right? That's heat rising from below, but it can't escape, because the air in this gap doesn't move. It just sits here, creating a barrier. Jim touched the surface himself, his expression shifting as he felt the warmth. It's so simple. The best ideas usually are. Why doesn't everyone build like this? Derek climbed back down the ladder, Jim following. Because it takes longer, costs more up front, and when you've got cheap electricity and gas furnaces, it seems unnecessary. He met Jim's eyes. Until it isn't. Jim was quiet for a long moment, processing what he'd learned. Then, I built a house that almost killed my family. 3 years ago, spent everything we had on smart technology, energy efficiency ratings, all the things the experts said mattered. His voice cracked slightly. My daughter almost died because I trusted the wrong things. Derek placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. You're here now. She's here now. That's what matters. But when this is over, you'll know better. And knowing better is the first step to doing better. The morning passed slowly, measured in cups of coffee and trips to the woodpile and the endless, hypnotic howl of wind outside. Derek found himself teaching without intending to. It started with the fire. Tom Hendricks had been adding wood incorrectly, too much at once, smothering the flames rather than feeding them. Derek showed him how to bank the coals, how to add fuel gradually, how to read the color of the flames to know when the stove was burning efficiently. You want a bed of coals first, Derek explained. Then you add your wood on top, one piece at a time. Let each piece catch before you add the next. Tom nodded, watching intently. My house has a gas fireplace. Push a button and it turns on. I never thought about any of this. Most people don't, until they have to. Then it was the water. Barbara Caldwell had assumed, reasonably, that they would need to melt snow for drinking water. Derek led her to the hand pump in the corner of the kitchen and demonstrated how it worked. The aquifer's 100 feet down, he said, working the handle until clear water flowed into the waiting bucket. Too deep to freeze. And the pump doesn't need electricity, just muscle. Barbara tried it herself, struggling at first with the rhythm, then finding her stride. Water splashed into the bucket, clean and cold and miraculous. I didn't know things like this still existed, she said. They exist. People just stopped looking for them. By noon, Derek had given impromptu lessons on fire management, water collection, food preservation, and the basics of staying warm without central heating. His audience had grown from 1 or 2 curious individuals to nearly everyone in the cabin, crowded around him like students around a teacher. Only Mayor Christine Walsh remained apart, sitting in a corner with her arms wrapped around herself, watching but not participating. Derek noticed but said nothing. Some lessons couldn't be taught. They had to be lived. The knock came at 1:30 in the afternoon. It was softer than the others had been. Not the desperate pounding of someone fleeing the cold, but a hesitant, almost reluctant sound. Derek's heart clenched in his chest before his mind could catch up with the reason. He crossed to the door and opened it. The man standing on the porch was nearly unrecognizable. His face was raw and red, ravaged by wind and cold. Ice crystals clung to his eyebrows and the stubble on his cheeks. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His expensive winter coat, the kind sold in Chicago boutiques to people who would never actually need it, was soaked through and stiff with frost. But his eyes, Derek would have known those eyes anywhere. Dad. Harold Bennett's voice was barely a whisper, scraped raw by cold and exhaustion and something deeper than either. I made it. I actually made it. Then his legs gave out, and Derek caught his son for the first time in 15 years. They laid Harold on the couch nearest the fire, stripping off his frozen clothes and wrapping him in every blanket they could find. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his shivering was so violent it shook the entire piece of furniture. Edna knelt beside her son, pressing warm cloths to his face and hands, tears streaming silently down her weathered cheeks. How long was he out there? Someone asked. Too long, Derek replied grimly. The story came out in fragments over the next hour, as Harold slowly warmed and his voice returned to something approaching normal. He had left Chicago 2 days ago, when the first warnings about the polar vortex hit the news. His original plan had been to arrive before the storm, to surprise his parents with an unannounced visit after 5 years of silence. But the weather had moved faster than predicted, and the roads had deteriorated faster than anyone expected. His car had died 20 miles outside Cedar Falls. The battery, drained by the heater running constantly, had simply given up. Harold had sat in the freezing vehicle for 3 hours, watching the temperature drop, waiting for help that never came. When he realized no one was coming, he started walking 20 miles. In negative 40-degree weather, with nothing but a Chicago winter coat and dress shoes meant for office buildings, not snowdrifts. "I kept thinking about this place," Harold said, his voice still rough. "About how you always said it could survive anything, how you built it to last." He closed his eyes. "I thought if I could just make it here, if I could just get home." Derek sat in the chair across from his son, his face unreadable. "Why did you come, Harold?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with 5 years of silence and 15 years of growing distance. Everyone else in the cabin had gone quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Harold opened his eyes and met his father's gaze. "Because I was wrong." "About what?" "About everything." Harold struggled to sit up, despite Edna's protests. "About you, about Mom, about this cabin, about what matters." His voice cracked. "I spent years telling myself I was too good for this life, that I'd moved beyond it, that you were holding on to the past while I was building the future." He gestured weakly at the warm cabin, at the strangers who had found shelter within its walls, at the storm that raged impotently outside. "But your past saved all these people, and my future almost killed me." Derek was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled, the wind howled. 22 people held their breath. "You're here now," Derek said finally. "That's what matters. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for—" "I know." Derek's voice was rough with emotion he rarely showed. "I know you are." He rose from his chair, crossed to the couch, and did something he hadn't done since Harold was a boy. He pulled his son into his arms and held him low. The afternoon brought more refugees. Word had spread somehow, perhaps through the emergency radio channels, perhaps simply through the desperate grapevine of people searching for salvation, that there was a cabin on the hill where the fire still burned and the door was still open. The Martinez family arrived at 3 o'clock, Roberto and Elena with their twin daughters, Lucia and Sofia, who were only 4 years old. They had walked 3 miles through the snow after their car got stuck on the highway, carrying the girls the entire way. Then came old Samuel Chen, the retired pharmacist who had run the drugstore on Main Street for 40 years. He brought his medical bag and immediately began checking the children for signs of frostbite, his gentle hands and calm voice a comfort to frightened parents. Then the Okonkwo family, David, his wife Grace, their teenage son Marcus, and Grace's elderly mother, who needed regular medication for her heart condition. Samuel Chen examined her immediately, his face grave but controlled. "Her blood pressure is elevated," he told Derek quietly. "The stress, the cold, the disruption to her medication schedule, she needs to stay warm and calm. She'll have both here," Derek promised. By evening, the cabin held 31 people. Derek had never imagined the walls could contain so many bodies, but somehow they did. People slept in shifts now, some on the furniture, some on the floor, some in the loft above. The wood stove burned constantly, fed by a rotating crew of volunteers who had learned Derek's lessons well. And through it all, the temperature outside continued its assault. Negative 51 degrees. Negative 52. Numbers that shouldn't have been possible. Numbers that spoke of a world gone wrong, of systems overwhelmed, of the thin membrane between civilization and chaos stretched to its breaking point. But inside the cabin, life continued. Edna organized the women into cooking shifts, producing meals from the pantry stores that somehow fed everyone. The children, after their initial terror had faded, began to treat the situation as an adventure. playing games by firelight, listening to stories, forming friendships that crossed every line of age and background. Derek watched it all with quiet wonder. 54 years ago, he had built this cabin as a refuge from a world that had broken him. The war had left scars that never fully healed, and he had needed silence and solitude to find his way back to himself. Edna had understood, had followed him into the wilderness without complaint, had built a life with him that was small and quiet and complete. He had never expected that the refuge he built for two would become a refuge for 31. On the evening of the second day, Harold found his father on the small covered porch, adding wood to the storage pile despite the brutal cold. "You shouldn't be out here," Harold said. "It's too cold. Wood doesn't split itself. Let me help." Derek paused, axe in hand, and looked at his son. Harold was still pale, still weak from his ordeal, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there for years. A willingness, a humility. Derek handed him the axe. They worked in silence for a while, taking turns splitting logs while the other stacked. The rhythm was familiar to Derek. He had done this same work with his own father, decades ago. But watching Harold struggle with the technique brought unexpected emotion to his throat. "You used to be better at this," Derek said finally. Harold laughed, a real laugh, the first Derek had heard from him in years. "I used to do it every day. Now I sit at a desk and tell other people what to do." "Is that what you wanted? The desk? The telling?" Harold set down the axe and leaned against the woodpile, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "I thought it was. I thought if I could just get far enough away from this." He gestured at the cabin, the woods, the life his parents had built. "I thought I'd finally be happy." "Were you?" "No." The word came out flat, honest. "I was successful. I was respected. I had money and status and everything I thought mattered." He met his father's eyes. "But I wasn't happy. I don't think I've been happy since I left." Derek was quiet for a moment, processing this confession from the son who had rejected everything he stood for. "Happiness isn't something you find," he said finally. "It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice." He picked up another log and positioned it on the splitting block. "Your mother and I didn't come out here because we were happy. We came out here because we were broken. And we built something that healed us. The cabin. Not just the cabin. The life. The work. The purpose." Derek swung the axe, splitting the log cleanly. "When you wake up every morning knowing exactly what needs to be done, and you do it, and you see the results of your labor, that's happiness. Not the feeling, the knowing." Harold was silent for a long time. "Can I learn?" he asked finally. "Is it too late?" Derek looked at his son, 53 years old, successful by every measure the world valued, and yet standing here in the cold, asking if he could learn to split wood. "It's never too late," Derek said, "but you have to want it, really want it, not just when the world is falling apart, but when everything's easy and comfortable and there's no reason to do things the hard way." "I want it," Harold said. "I think I've wanted it for years. I was just too proud to admit it." Derek handed him another log. "Then let's start now." Inside the cabin, Edna was telling stories. The children had gathered around her chair by the fire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. Some of the adults had joined them too: Elena Martinez, Grace Okonkwo, even Mayor Christine Walsh, who had finally emerged from her corner and rejoined the group. Edna told them about the early years, when she and Derek had first moved to the property. About the winter, the stovepipe cracked and Derek had repaired it in the middle of the night, his fingers so cold he couldn't feel them. About the spring, they planted their first garden and watched deer eat half of it before they learned to build a proper fence. About the summer, Harold was born, right here in this cabin, delivered by Derek himself because the roads were washed out and no doctor could reach them. "You were born here?" young Emma Hendricks asked, her eyes wide. "All 3 of our children were born in this cabin," Edna confirmed. "Harold, then Susan, then Michael." Derek delivered each one of them. "Where are Susan and Michael now?" someone asked. Edna's smile flickered, just slightly. "Susan lives in California. Michael is in Texas. They have their own lives, their own families. She paused. They don't visit much anymore. The room went quiet. Everyone understood what she wasn't saying, that the distance wasn't just geographical, that the children who had been born in this cabin had grown up and left and, like Harold, had decided that their parents' way of life wasn't worth preserving. But Harold came back. Little Jacob Hendricks said, his voice innocent and clear. He walked all the way through the snow to come home. Edna's eyes glistened. Yes, sweetheart, he did. That's because this is a magic cabin, Jacob declared, with the certainty of a 5-year-old. It keeps everyone warm and safe, even when everything else is cold. Edna reached out and touched the boy's cheek. Maybe you're right, she said softly. Maybe it is magic, just not the kind you read about in books. That night, after everyone had settled into their sleeping spots and the cabin had grown quiet, Derek sat alone by the fire. The radio, turned low, crackled with updates that grew more dire by the hour. The death toll across the region had reached 47. Emergency services were overwhelmed. The power grid showed no signs of recovery. Officials were calling it the worst natural disaster in Minnesota history. And tomorrow would be colder still. Derek stared into the flames, thinking about his father. Eric Bennett had died in 1985, in this very cabin, in the bed Derek now shared with Edna. He had been 87 years old, his body worn out by a lifetime of hard work, but his mind sharp until the very end. "Remember what I taught you," Eric had said, gripping Derek's hand with surprising strength. Not just the building, the knowing, the understanding of how things work, why they work, what happens when they stop working. "I'll remember, Papa." "Good, because someday someone will need what you know. Someday the world will forget how to survive, and it will need people like us to remind it." Derek had thought, at the time, that his father was being dramatic. The world of 1985 had seemed stable, permanent, too advanced to ever need the old ways again. Now, 40 years later, he understood. The world hadn't forgotten how to survive. It had simply convinced itself that survival was someone else's problem, that technology would always work, that systems would always function, that the old knowledge, the wisdom of people who had lived through harder times, was quaint but unnecessary, until a polar vortex proved otherwise. Derek rose from his chair and moved through the sleeping cabin, checking on each person in turn. The Hendricks children, curled together like puppies. The Martinez twins, their small faces peaceful in sleep. Old Mrs. Patterson, whose breathing had grown steadier since Samuel Chen adjusted her positioning. Harold, stretched out on the floor near the fire, his face younger in sleep than it had looked in years. 31 people, 31 lives, 31 reasons to keep the fire burning. Derek added another log to the stove, adjusted the damper, and settled back into his chair. Outside, the temperature dropped to -53 degrees. Inside, the cabin held steady, and somewhere in the frozen darkness, a sound Derek hadn't heard in days reached his ears, the distant wail of sirens, suggesting that somewhere out there, help was finally beginning to mobilize. But they wouldn't arrive tonight, maybe not tomorrow either. For now, this cabin on the hill was all that stood between 31 people and the killing cold. The third day brought the first real crisis. It started with a cough. Little Sophia Martinez, one of the 4-year-old twins, had been sniffling since she arrived. Her mother, Elena, had attributed it to the cold, the stress, the exhaustion of their harrowing trek through the snow. But by morning, the sniffles had become a deep, rattling cough that shook her small body and left her gasping for breath. Samuel Chen examined her by the light of the frost-covered window, his weathered hands gentle as they pressed against her chest and back. "Bronchitis," he said quietly to Elena and Roberto, "possibly developing into pneumonia. She needs antibiotics, and she needs them soon." Elena's face crumpled. "Where are we supposed to get antibiotics? The pharmacies are all closed. The hospitals, I know." Samuel's voice was calm but grave. "I have some basic supplies in my medical bag, but nothing that will treat this. If her fever spikes, if her breathing gets worse." He didn't finish the sentence. Derek had been listening from across the room. He approached the group, his face thoughtful. "The clinic on Maple Street," he said. "Doc Harrison's place. He kept a supply room in the back. Antibiotics, basic medications. Would that help?" Samuel's eyes lit up. "If we could access it, yes. But that's almost 2 miles from here. And in these conditions, I'll go." Everyone turned to look at Harold, who had risen from his spot by the fire. He was still pale, still recovering from his own ordeal, but his jaw was set with determination. "Harold, no," Edna said immediately. "You almost died getting here. You can't go back out there." "Mom, I spent 20 years running away from hard things, from responsibility, from this family." Harold met his father's eyes. "Let me do something that matters." Derek studied his son for a long moment. The cabin had gone quiet, everyone watching the exchange. "You can't go alone," Derek said finally. "The buddy system, if something happens to one person, the other can get help. I'll go with him." The voice came from an unexpected source. Mayor Christine Walsh stepped forward, her expensive coat now wrinkled and stained, her politician's composure replaced by something rawer and more human. "I know the clinic," she continued. "I know Doc Harrison. He gave me the tour when we were discussing the town's emergency preparedness plan." She laughed bitterly. "Not that any of our plans accounted for this." Derek looked at the mayor, the woman who had tried to condemn his home, who had called him a relic, who had arrived at his door begging for the shelter she'd once tried to destroy. "You sure about this?" he asked. Christine met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Bennett, I've spent 3 days watching you and your wife save people, feed people, teach people, while I sat in a corner feeling sorry for myself." She straightened her shoulders. "It's time I did something useful." Derek nodded slowly. "All right, but you do exactly what I tell you, both of you." The next hour was spent preparing. Derek retrieved gear from the storage closet he hadn't opened in years. Snowshoes his father had made by hand, weatherproof parkas lined with wool, face masks designed to prevent frostbite. He showed Harold and Christine how to layer their clothing, how to protect their extremities, how to recognize the signs of hypothermia in themselves and each other. "You've got maybe 45 minutes in this cold," he said. 60 if you keep moving. After that, your body starts shutting down. You get confused. You make mistakes. You die." "Understood," Harold said. "The clinic is southeast of here. Follow the tree line until you hit the old logging road, then follow the road into town. It's the most sheltered route." Derek handed Harold a compass. "If the snow picks up and you can't see, trust the compass, not your instincts. Your instincts will lie to you in a whiteout." Christine took the compass from Harold and studied it. "I haven't used one of these since Girl Scouts." "Then it's a good thing Harold knows the area." Derek turned to his son. "You remember the way?" Harold nodded. "I used to walk to Doc Harrison's for my allergy shots every month. I could do it blindfolded." "Don't get cocky. The cold will kill you faster than confidence." Derek gripped Harold's shoulder. "Get in. Get the medicine. Get out. Don't try to be a hero. Just come home." Harold's eyes glistened. "I will, Dad. I promise." They left at 10 in the morning. The cabin watched them go through frost-covered windows, 2 figures in heavy parkas, moving carefully across the snow-covered hillside, growing smaller and smaller until the white swallowed them whole. Edna stood at the window long after they disappeared, her hands clasped together, her lips moving in silent prayer. Derek joined her, placing a weathered hand on her shoulder. "He'll be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. "I can't lose him again," Edna whispered. "Not like this. Not after he finally came home. You won't. He's stronger than he knows." He just forgot for a while. They stood together in silence, watching the empty white expanse where their son had vanished, and waited. Inside the cabin, time moved like honey, slow, thick, almost unbearable. Samuel Chen sat with Sophia Martinez, monitoring her breathing, keeping her fever down with cool cloths and the limited medication he had available. The little girl drifted in and out of sleep, her twin sister Lucia refusing to leave her side. "Is she going to die?" Lucia asked, her 4-year-old voice trembling. Samuel smiled gently. "No, sweetheart. She's sick, but she's going to get better. Some very brave people went to get her medicine. The man who walked through the snow? And the lady with the fancy coat? That's right. Lucia considered this. They must be very brave. It's really cold outside. Yes, it is. That's why we're all so lucky to be in here, where it's warm. The little girl nodded solemnly, then curled up next to her sister on the makeshift bed, holding her hand. Samuel watched them with an expression that mixed professional concern with something deeper, a grandfather's tenderness, perhaps, for children who weren't his own, but who had somehow become his responsibility. At noon, Derek gathered the able-bodied adults for a lesson. The worst thing we can do right now is sit and worry, he said. So we're going to learn something instead. He led them to the small covered porch, where the woodpile was stacked, and began to teach. He showed them how to identify good firewood, the weight of it, the sound it made when knocked together, the way properly seasoned wood had cracks radiating from the center. He demonstrated splitting technique, the angle of the axe, and the importance of letting gravity do most of the work. You don't swing harder, he explained. You swing smarter. The axe does the work if you let it. Tom Hendricks tried first, his initial swings clumsy and ineffective. But under Derek's patient guidance, he improved, and by his 10th log, he had found a rhythm that produced clean splits with minimal effort. I've never done this before, Tom admitted, slightly breathless. Never even occurred to me that I should know how. Most people don't think about it, Derek replied, until the power goes out and the gas stops flowing, and suddenly you realize you don't know how to keep your family warm. Jim Caldwell took a turn next, then Danny Morrison, then Roberto Martinez. Even Frank Wheeler, despite his age, insisted on splitting a few logs, his old sheriff's arms still strong enough for the work. By the time they finished, they had added 24 logs to the pile, and every man present had learned a skill their grandfathers had taken for granted. This is what we've lost, Derek said, surveying the group. Not just the knowledge, but the willingness to learn. We got so comfortable with our thermostats and our delivery apps that we forgot what it means to take care of ourselves. Can it be taught again? Jim asked. I mean, after this is over, can people learn this stuff, or is it too late? Derek considered the question. It's never too late to learn, but it takes time and practice, and most importantly, it takes wanting to learn. He looked around at the faces watching him. You're all here because the world forced you to need this knowledge. The question is whether you'll keep needing it after the world goes back to normal. The afternoon crawled past. Edna kept busy in the kitchen, preparing a lunch of soup and bread that somehow stretched to feed 31 people. The children, restless after days of confinement, had invented games to play, hide and seek in the limited space, storytelling competitions, an elaborate fantasy world involving the cabin, the storm, and a cast of characters that grew more complex by the hour. Grace Okonkwo sat with her mother, whose condition had stabilized under Samuel Chen's care. The elderly woman slept most of the time now, her breathing shallow but steady. She always talked about the old days, Grace said quietly to Edna, who had brought them tea, about growing up in Nigeria, in a village where they had nothing, no electricity, no running water, just family and community and whatever they could grow or make themselves. She sounds like a wise woman. She is. I just wish I'd listened more. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She tried to teach me things, how to cook traditional meals, how to preserve food, how to make do with less, and I was always too busy, too modern, too convinced that I didn't need any of it. Edna sat down beside her. We all make that mistake. We all think we've moved beyond the old ways, until we find ourselves needing them again. Your husband knows so much, all these skills, all this knowledge. How did he learn it all? From his father. And his father learned from his father before him. Edna smiled. That's how wisdom survives. Person to person, generation to generation. It's the only way it's ever survived. Will you teach us? Grace asked. Not just the emergency stuff, the survival skills, but all of it. The cooking, the preserving, the making do. Edna took the younger woman's hand. I would be honored. By 3 o'clock, Worry had become a living thing in the cabin. Harold and Christine had been gone for 5 hours. The trip should have taken 2 hours, 3 at most. Every minute past that window increased the chances that something had gone wrong. Derek stood at the window, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the white emptiness for any sign of movement. Behind him, the cabin had gone quiet. Even the children seemed to sense that something was wrong, their games abandoned, their voices hushed. Maybe they found shelter somewhere, Tom Hendricks suggested, waited out a whiteout or something. Maybe, Derek replied, though his voice carried no conviction. Should we send someone to look for them? Jim Caldwell asked. No, if they're lost, sending more people won't help. It'll just give us more people to lose. Derek's hands clenched at his sides. We wait. We trust them to find their way back. Edna appeared at his elbow, her face pale but composed. Derek, come away from the window. You staring at the snow won't bring them home any faster. I can't just— Yes, you can. You can come sit down and have some tea and trust your son to do what he needs to do. Her voice was firm but gentle. You taught him, remember? All those years ago before he left. You taught him everything you knew. He forgot most of it, did he? Or did he just push it aside for a while? Edna guided him away from the window. Some knowledge doesn't disappear, Derek. It waits. And when you need it, it comes back. At 4:17 in the afternoon, young Marcus Okonkwo shouted from the loft. Someone's coming. I can see 2 people. The cabin erupted into motion. Derek reached the window first, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes straining to see through the frost. 2 figures, moving slowly but steadily up the hillside, supporting each other against the wind. Harold and Christine. Derek was out the door before anyone could stop him, plunging into the brutal cold, wading through snow that reached his knees. Edna followed, then Tom and Jim and Danny, a rescue party that met the returning heroes halfway down the slope. Harold's face was white with exhaustion, his eyebrows frozen solid, his lips cracked and bleeding, but in his arms he clutched a bag, a medical bag, bulging with supplies. We got it, he gasped as Derek reached him. Antibiotics, fever reducers, even found some oxygen canisters in the back room. Doc Harrison had a whole emergency supply. He managed a weak smile. Building was frozen solid, but the supply room was insulated. Everything was fine. Christine Walsh was in even worse shape. She'd twisted her ankle on the return journey and had been limping the last mile, supported by Harold. But her eyes were bright with something that looked like triumph. We did it, she said to Derek. We actually did it. Derek didn't waste time with words. He took the medical bag from Harold, handed it to Jim, and then wrapped his arms around his son. You came home, he said, his voice rough. You actually came home. Samuel Chen worked through the evening. The antibiotics went to Sophia Martinez first, along with fever reducers and fluids. The little girl was still dangerously ill, but with proper medication, her chances improved dramatically. The oxygen canisters went to Grace's mother, whose breathing had grown more labored during the afternoon. Within an hour of receiving supplemental oxygen, her color improved and her vital signs stabilized. Other supplies from Doc Harrison's office were distributed as needed: bandages for the minor frostbite several people had suffered, pain relievers for aching joints and muscles, antiseptic for cuts and scrapes that had gone untreated in the chaos. You saved lives today, Samuel told Harold and Christine as he worked. Real lives. Not hypothetically, not abstractly. That little girl would have died without those antibiotics. Harold sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, still shivering from his ordeal. But he was smiling. It felt good, he admitted. Actually doing something instead of just talking about doing something. Christine, her ankle wrapped and elevated, nodded in agreement. I've spent my entire career making decisions that affected people's lives. Budget allocations, zoning laws, emergency plans. She laughed bitterly. But I never actually helped anyone. Not like this. Not face to face, life to life. Derek brought them both hot soup and settled into his chair across from them. That's the difference, he said, between power and service. Power is what you do from a distance. Service is what you do up close. Christine was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Mr. Bennett, I owe you an apology. You already apologized. First night. No, I mean a real apology. Not just for showing up at your door asking for help I didn't deserve." She set down her soup and met his eyes. 18 months ago, I stood in front of the town council and argued that this cabin should be condemned. I called it an eyesore. I said it had no place in modern Cedar Falls. I remember. I was wrong, not just about the cabin, about everything it represents. I thought progress meant moving forward, leaving the past behind. I thought modern was always better than old. She gestured at the warm cabin, at the 31 people it sheltered, at the storm raging impotently outside. But this is what survives. Not my smart home with its app-controlled thermostat. This. Derek was silent for a moment, considering her words. "Progress isn't bad," he said finally. "Technology isn't bad, but it's a tool, not a foundation. You can't build a house on tools alone. You need knowledge, skill, understanding. You need to know what to do when the tools fail. And most of us don't. No, most of you don't." Derek's voice was kind, but honest. "That's not your fault. You grew up in a world where the tools always worked. Why would you learn anything else?" "But we should have," Christine's voice cracked with emotion. "We should have listened to people like you, instead of dismissing you as relics." Well, Derek allowed himself a small smile. "You're listening now. If you're enjoying this story, I'd love to hear, have you ever changed your mind about someone after seeing them in a crisis? Share in the comments below." That night, something shifted in the cabin. It wasn't anything dramatic, no announcement, no formal change. But the atmosphere had transformed somehow, becoming less like a refugee shelter and more like a community. Perhaps it was Harold and Christine's successful mission, proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demanded it. Perhaps it was the simple accumulation of 3 days living in close quarters, sharing meals and stories and the warmth of a single fire. Whatever the cause, the cabin felt different now. Edna noticed it first, the way people had begun helping each other without being asked. Barbara Caldwell had taken over diaper duty for the Rodriguez baby, giving the exhausted parents a chance to rest. Marcus Okonkwo was teaching the younger children card games his grandmother had taught him. Mrs. Patterson, despite her age and frailty, had appointed herself the cabin's organizer, keeping track of supplies and schedules with the precision of someone who had run a post office for 40 years. "We're becoming something," Edna said quietly to Derek as they prepared for bed. "Something more than strangers waiting out a storm." "People do that," Derek replied. "When they're forced together, when they have to depend on each other, they become a community. It's the most human thing there is. It's what we lost, isn't it? In the modern world, all those houses full of people who don't know their neighbors, don't need their neighbors, don't even see their neighbors." Derek nodded. "Technology made us independent, which sounds good until you realize that independence is just another word for isolation." Edna was quiet for a moment, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling into sleep, the murmur of voices, the crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of children who had found safety in a world gone cold. "Maybe something good will come of this," she said. "When it's over, maybe people will remember what it felt like to need each other. Maybe." Derek wasn't optimistic. He had lived long enough to see how quickly people forgot lessons written in crisis. But maybe this time would be different. Maybe 31 people sharing one cabin for one impossible week would plant seeds that survived the spring. "Get some sleep," he told his wife. "Tomorrow will be another long day. Will you sleep?" Derek looked toward the window, where frost had formed patterns like frozen ferns on the glass. Beyond it, invisible in the darkness, the storm continued its assault. "Eventually," he said. "Eventually." The 4th day brought tentative hope. The radio reported that temperatures had stabilized, still brutally cold at -48 degrees, but no longer dropping. Power crews were working around the clock to restore the grid, and officials estimated that some areas might have electricity within 48 hours. But along with hope came a new challenge. The woodpile was shrinking. Derek had calculated for a household of 2, with reserves for emergencies. He had not calculated for 31 people generating body heat that required constant compensation, using water that had to be pumped and heated, cooking meals that demanded fuel. At the current rate of consumption, they had perhaps 4 days of wood remaining. "Can we get more?" Harold asked when Derek shared the news with him. "There's timber in the forest, but it's green, won't burn properly. Good firewood needs to be cut and dried for at least 6 months." Derek shook his head. "We could try to salvage wood from abandoned structures in town, but that would mean another expedition in this cold. I could go—" "No, you're still recovering, and we can't risk losing you again." Derek thought for a moment. "We'll conserve, keep the fire smaller, add more blankets. Body heat will help. 31 people generate a lot of warmth on their own. Will it be enough? It'll have to be." The conservation measures were harder than Derek expected. Not physically. The adjustments to the fire were simple enough, and people adapted quickly to wearing extra layers indoors. But psychologically, the reduced flames felt like defeat. The roaring fire that had welcomed refugees, that had symbolized safety and warmth, was now banked to a modest glow that barely pushed back the cabin's growing chill. Temperatures inside dropped from 68 degrees to 62, then to 58. The children stopped playing and huddled under blankets. The elderly complained of aching joints. Even the healthy adults began to feel the bite of cold that seeped through walls no longer fully warmed. "We're losing," Tom Hendricks said quietly to Derek on the afternoon of the 4th day. "Slowly, but we're losing." "We're not losing," Derek replied. "We're adapting. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Losing means giving up. Adapting means changing your approach while you keep fighting." Derek looked around the cabin, at the people huddled together, sharing warmth, enduring discomfort without complaint. Look at them. Nobody's quitting. Nobody's panicking. They're cold and tired and scared, but they're holding on. Because of you. Because of each other. Derek shook his head. "I built the walls. I taught them how to survive, but they're the ones doing the surviving. That's something no one can give you. It has to come from inside." On the evening of the 4th day, the radio brought news that changed everything. Power has been restored to the eastern grid sector, including portions of Cedar Falls. Utility crews are working through the night to expand coverage. Residents in restored areas are asked to limit electricity use to essential functions only. The cabin erupted in cheers. "Power!" Barbara Caldwell shouted. "They're getting the power back." "How long until it reaches us?" someone asked. "Could be hours," Frank Wheeler said, his old sheriff's instincts parsing the announcement. "Could be another day or two." They have to prioritize hospitals, emergency services, then residential areas. "But it's coming," Elena Martinez said, tears streaming down her face. "It's actually coming." Derek allowed himself a cautious smile. The news was good, better than good, but he had lived through enough winters to know that hope was a dangerous thing. It could make you careless. It could make you drop your guard at exactly the wrong moment. "We keep the fire going," he announced. "We keep conserving. Until the power's actually on and the heat's actually working, nothing changes." A few people looked disappointed, but most understood. They had learned, in 4 days, to trust Derek Bennett's judgment over their own optimism. "One more night," Edna said, squeezing her husband's hand. "Maybe 2. We can do this." "Yes," Derek agreed. "We can." But that night, as the cabin settled into uneasy sleep and the fire burned low, Derek sat alone by the window and allowed himself to feel something he had suppressed for 4 days. Fear. Not for himself. He had made peace with his own mortality years ago. But for these people who had come to his door, who had trusted him with their lives, who were now counting on him to get them through one more night, one more day, one more hour. 31 people. 11 of them children, all of them depending on a cabin built by a young man 54 years ago, using techniques taught by a father who was now 40 years dead. What if it wasn't enough? What if the wood ran out before the power returned? What if someone got sick, really sick, and they couldn't help? What if the temperature dropped again, beyond even what the double roof could handle? Derek closed his eyes and thought of his father. Remember what I taught you, not just the building, the knowing, the understanding of how things work, why they work, what happens when they stop working. He had remembered. For 54 years, he had remembered. The fifth day dawned with a silence that felt different from the days before. Derek woke in his chair by the window. He had never made it to bed and immediately sensed the change. The wind had stopped. For 5 days, it had howled around the cabin like a living thing, clawing at the walls, screaming through every gap and crack. Now, there was nothing, just stillness. He rose stiffly, his 78-year-old joints protesting, the night spent upright, and moved to the window. The frost had formed thick patterns on the glass, but through them he could see something he hadn't seen in nearly a week. Blue sky. Not much, just a pale strip along the eastern horizon, barely visible through the lingering clouds. But it was there. The storm was breaking. Derek? Edna had appeared beside him, wrapped in her quilted robe, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. "Look," he said, pointing. She squinted through the frost, and then her hand found his and squeezed. "It's ending," she whispered. "It's finally ending." The morning brought a flurry of activity. The radio confirmed what the sky had suggested. The polar vortex was retreating northward. Temperatures were expected to rise over the next 48 hours, and power restoration was proceeding faster than expected. Some neighborhoods in Cedar Falls already had electricity. Others would follow throughout the day. But the cabin remained dark. The hill where Derek and Edna lived was at the end of a long power line that served only a handful of properties. It would be among the last to be restored. "Doesn't matter," Derek said when someone expressed frustration at the news. "We've made it this far. Another day or two won't break us." But privately, he was worried. The woodpile had dwindled to less than 2 days' supply. They had stretched it as far as possible. Smaller fires, more blankets, bodies huddled together for warmth. But physics was physics. You couldn't create heat from nothing, and they were running out of something. Harold found him on the porch that afternoon, stacking the remaining logs for easier access. "How bad is it?" Harold asked. Derek didn't bother lying. "Bad. If the power doesn't come back by tomorrow night, we'll have to start burning furniture." "The furniture?" "The old dresser in the bedroom, the bookshelf in the corner, anything made of solid wood that we can break down." Derek shook his head. "It's not ideal. Furniture wood doesn't burn as clean as proper firewood, but it's better than nothing." Harold was quiet for a moment, watching his father work. Then, "What about the trees? The ones around the cabin? Green wood won't burn properly. Too much moisture. You'd just fill the cabin with smoke. But if we cut it and dried it, takes months, son. We don't have months. We might not have days." Harold absorbed this, his face tight with frustration. "There has to be something we can do, something more." Derek set down the log he was holding and turned to face his son. "Harold, listen to me." His voice was calm but firm. "We have done everything possible. We have stretched our resources, shared what we had, kept 31 people alive through the worst storm in Minnesota history. Whatever happens next is out of our hands. But, no, this is something you need to understand." Derek gripped his son's shoulder. "You can prepare. You can plan. You can work harder than anyone else and know more than anyone else. But at some point, you've done everything you can, and you have to let go. You have to trust that it will be enough. And if it isn't?" Derek was quiet for a long moment. The pale winter sun cast long shadows across the snow, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called, the first bird song they had heard in days. "Then, we'll face that together," he said finally. "All of us. That's what community means. Not that bad things don't happen, but that when they do, you don't face them alone." That evening, Edna did something she hadn't done in years. She played the piano. The old upright had sat in the corner of the cabin for decades, a relic from her mother's house that she couldn't bear to part with. It was out of tune, hopelessly so, and several keys stuck when you pressed them. But as the sun set on the 5th day and the cabin grew cold despite the small fire, Edna sat down on the worn bench and began to play. The song was Amazing Grace. Her fingers found the notes from memory, moving across the yellowed keys with a grace that belied their stiffness. The sound was imperfect, wavering notes, missed beats, the occasional clunk of a stuck key, but it was beautiful nonetheless. One by one, the cabin fell silent. The children stopped their games. The adults set down their tasks. Even the babies seemed to quiet, as if recognizing something sacred in the moment. And then, softly at first, voices began to join. Edna didn't know who started singing. Maybe it was Mrs. Patterson, the old widow from the post office, whose church-trained alto could still hold a tune. Maybe it was Grace Okonkwo, whose Nigerian hymns had echoed through the cabin on previous nights. Maybe it was one of the children, innocent voices lifted in a song they half remembered from Sunday school. But within moments, everyone was singing. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. Derek stood at the edge of the room, watching his wife play. Listening to 30 voices rise together in the cramped space, his throat tightened with emotion he couldn't name. This was it. This was what survival really meant. Not just keeping bodies warm and bellies full, but keeping spirits alive, keeping hope burning when everything outside was cold and dark and deadly. His father had taught him how to build a cabin that could withstand any winter. But Edna had built something even more important. She had built a family out of strangers, a community out of refugees, a chorus out of people who had arrived at their door with nothing but fear and desperation. The song ended, and for a moment, the cabin was silent. Then little Jacob Hendricks spoke up from his spot by the fire. "Can we sing another one?" Edna smiled, her eyes bright with tears, and turned back to the piano. They sang until midnight, hymns and folk songs and Christmas carols. Even though Christmas was weeks away, they sang until voices grew hoarse and children fell asleep and the fire burned down to embers that cast dancing shadows on the walls. And when they finally stopped, when the cabin settled into exhausted silence, something had changed. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were family. If this moment touched your heart, take a second to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And stay with me. We're almost at the end. The 6th day brought a miracle. It started with a rumble, deep and mechanical, audible even through the cabin's thick walls. Derek was at the window immediately, his heart pounding with desperate hope. A convoy was making its way up the hill. 3 National Guard vehicles, their heavy tires churning through snow that would have stopped any civilian car. Behind them, a utility truck with the power company's logo on the side. "They're here," Derek breathed. "They're actually here." The cabin erupted into chaos. People rushed to windows, crowded onto the porch, shouted and waved at the approaching vehicles. Children who had been listless with cold suddenly found reserves of energy, jumping and cheering as the trucks drew closer. A young National Guard officer was the first to reach the door. "Mr. Bennett?" he asked, slightly out of breath from the climb. "Derek Bennett? That's me. Sir, we've been hearing about this cabin for 2 days. Everyone we rescued kept talking about the place on the hill that stayed warm." The officer looked past Derek at the crowded interior, his eyes widening. "How many people do you have in here?" 31, 32, counting myself. "In this space? It's bigger than it looks." The officer shook his head in disbelief. "Sir, I've been doing rescue operations for 3 days. We've found people frozen in houses twice this size. I don't know how you managed this, but..." He trailed off, apparently unable to find words adequate to the situation. "Can you help us?" Derek asked. "We're running low on fuel. Another day and the power crews restoring your line right now should have electricity within the hour." The officer gestured to the utility truck. "And we brought supplies, food, water, medical equipment, whatever you need. Derek felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For 6 days, he had held this community together through sheer will and whatever wisdom his father had left him. Now, finally, help had arrived. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you." The power came back at 2:47 inches the afternoon. Someone had left a lamp plugged in, and when the electricity surged through the restored lines, it flickered to life. A small, ordinary miracle that drew gasps from everyone in the cabin. "We have power," Barbara Caldwell shouted, as if announcing the second coming. "We actually have power!" The National Guard had set up a temporary command post in the cabin's yard, coordinating with other rescue teams and beginning the process of returning people to their homes, or what remained of their homes. The news from town was mixed. Some houses had survived with minimal damage. Others had been destroyed by burst pipes and ice. A few had burned when desperate residents tried to heat them with makeshift fires. But everyone in the Bennett cabin was alive. Everyone was healthy. Everyone would go home. The first to leave were the families with young children. Tom Hendricks loaded his kids into a National Guard vehicle, pausing at the door to shake Derek's hand. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken when he first arrived. But they meant something different now, deeper, more profound. "Just remember what you learned," Derek replied. "Pass it on to your kids. Make sure they know how to survive without pressing a button." "I will. I promise." The Martinez family went next, little Sophia wrapped in blankets and clutching the stuffed bear Mrs. Patterson had given her. The antibiotics had worked, her fever had broken on the 5th day, and Samuel Chen had declared her out of danger. She would recover fully. "Gracias," Roberto said, his eyes wet. "For everything. For my daughter's life." Derek just nodded. There were no words for what had passed between them. One by one, the families left. The Caldwells, with their infant daughter who had almost frozen in their smart home. The Okonkwo's, Grace's mother stable enough now to travel. Danny Morrison, the gas station kid who had arrived in nothing but his work uniform. Mrs. Patterson, who hugged Edna for a full minute before allowing the National Guard to help her down the hill. By evening, only a handful of people remained. Frank Wheeler and Duke, waiting for a ride to his nephew's house across town. Samuel Chen, who had insisted on staying until the last person was safely evacuated. Mayor Christine Walsh, whose ankle had healed enough for walking but who seemed reluctant to leave. And Harold. The conversation happened after dinner. Most of the remaining guests had fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's emotional upheaval. Derek and Harold sat on the covered porch, watching the stars emerge in a sky that had finally cleared. "I called Susan and Michael," Harold said quietly, "while you were helping with the evacuations." Derek looked at his son. "How are they?" "Worried." The news coverage of the storm reached California and Texas. "They didn't know if you and Mom were alive or dead." Harold paused. "They want to come visit. As soon as the airports reopen, that would be nice." "Dad." Harold turned to face his father. "I want to stay." Derek waited, not just for a visit. "I mean stay. Move back here. Learn everything you can teach me. Help you maintain this place." Harold's voice was steady but emotional. "I've spent my whole life running from who I am, from where I came from. And this week showed me exactly where that running got me. Nearly dead in a snowbank, crawling back to the only place that could save me." "What about your job? Your life in Chicago?" "My job is pushing papers for people who don't care about anything except money. My life in Chicago is an apartment I barely see and relationships I barely maintain." Harold shook his head. "That's not living, Dad. That's existing. And I'm tired of just existing." Derek was quiet for a long moment, processing his son's words. For 15 years, he had mourned Harold's absence. The son who had rejected everything he stood for, who had disappeared into a world Derek didn't understand or belong to. Now that son was sitting beside him, asking to come home. "It won't be easy," Derek said finally. "This life takes work, real work, physical work, and you're not 25 anymore." I know. You'll have to learn everything from scratch. How to chop wood, how to maintain the systems, how to survive when everything goes wrong. I know. And your mother will cry. She'll cry for a week when she realizes you're actually staying. Harold laughed, a wet, emotional sound. I know that too. Derek looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't seen in 15 years. The boy he had raised, the young man he had taught, the son he had loved even when that love wasn't returned. "Welcome home, Harold," he said. "Welcome home." The seventh day was for goodbyes. Frank Wheeler left in the morning, Duke padding contentedly beside him. The old sheriff had been transformed by the week, his cynicism softened, his faith in humanity restored. "You know," he told Derek, 30 years as sheriff, "I thought I'd seen everything people were capable of, the worst of human nature. But this week," he gestured at the cabin, "this week showed me the best. And I think I needed to see that before I die." Samuel Chen was the last of the guests to go. "What you did here should be studied," he told Derek as they shook hands. "Not just the building, the community. How you brought people together, gave them purpose, made them feel safe. That's medicine too, you know. Maybe the most important kind. Just treated people the way I'd want to be treated," Derek replied. "Nothing special about that." "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Bennett," Samuel smiled. "These days, that's the most special thing there is." Mayor Christine Walsh left last. She stood on the porch with Derek and Edna, looking out over the valley where Cedar Falls was slowly coming back to life. Smoke rose from chimneys again. Cars moved on, cleared roads. The town that had nearly died was breathing once more. "Mr. Bennett," Christine said, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt I can never repay. You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do, and not just for saving my life." She turned to face him. "You saved this town. Not single-handedly, you're too modest to accept that, but without this cabin, without your knowledge, without your willingness to open your door to people who had done nothing but disrespect you, the death toll would have been catastrophic." Derek said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I'm going to do something," Christine continued. "When I get back to town, when things settle down, I'm going to propose the creation of the Bennett Resilience Center." "What?" "A place where people can learn what you know. Building techniques, survival skills, traditional knowledge, all of it. Not as a museum, but as a school. So that the next time something like this happens, and there will be a next time, people will be ready." Derek stared at her. "You want to teach people to be self-sufficient? That's not exactly the kind of thing town councils usually support. This town council will. Trust me." Christine's expression was fierce with determination. "And if they won't, I'll make sure they do. I have some political capital saved up, and I can't think of a better way to spend it." She extended her hand, and Derek shook it. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for the shelter, for the lessons, for the second chance. Thank you for having the courage to ask for it." Christine Walsh walked down the hill, climbed into the waiting car, and drove away. Derek and Edna watched until she disappeared around the bend in the road. "Well," Edna said, "that's everyone." "Not everyone." Derek looked toward the cabin, where Harold was visible through the window, adding wood to the stove. "Not quite everyone." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Cedar Falls slowly returned to normal, or something like normal. Houses were repaired, pipes were replaced, lives resumed their familiar rhythms. But something had changed. The people who had sheltered in the Bennett cabin didn't forget what they'd learned. They didn't forget what they'd experienced. Tom Hendricks enrolled in a wilderness survival course and started teaching his children the basics of fire making. Jim Caldwell hired a contractor to install a wood-burning stove as a backup heating system. The Martinez family began keeping emergency supplies. Real supplies, not just a flashlight and some batteries. And every Sunday, without any formal arrangement, people started showing up at the Bennett cabin. Not for shelter, the crisis was over, but for lessons, for knowledge, for the chance to learn from a 78-year-old man who had somehow become the most important teacher in town. Derek taught them everything: how to split wood and bank a fire, how to pump water from a well, how to preserve food and insulate walls and read the weather, how to survive when the systems failed and the power went out and the world revealed just how fragile modern life really was. Harold was always beside him, learning alongside the others, taking notes, asking questions. The son who had rejected his father's wisdom was now its most devoted student. And Edna taught in her own way. She taught cooking and canning and quilting. She taught songs and stories and the names of plants that grew wild in the woods. She taught that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about staying human. In March, Mayor Christine Walsh kept her promise. The Cedar Falls Town Council unanimously approved the creation of the Bennett Resilience Center, funded by a combination of public money and private donations from people whose lives had been saved during the storm. The center would be built on land adjacent to the Bennett cabin, with Derek serving as its founding director. "I don't know anything about running a center," Derek protested when Christine presented the plan. "You don't need to. You just need to do what you've been doing," she smiled. "Teach, share, keep the knowledge alive." The groundbreaking ceremony was held in April, on the first warm day of spring. Nearly 200 people attended, far more than the cabin could have held, spread across the hillside in a sea of folding chairs and standing observers. The survivors of the storm were there, of course, along with their families and friends. But so were people from across the region, drawn by news coverage of the miracle cabin on the hill. Mayor Walsh gave a speech about resilience and community. Samuel Chen spoke about the medical aspects of the crisis and the lives saved by Harold and Christine's expedition. Tom Hendricks talked about what it felt like to arrive at the cabin's door with his children freezing and find warmth and welcome inside. Then it was Derek's turn. He stood at the small podium, looking out at the crowd, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, seen. "I don't have a fancy speech prepared," he began. "I'm not a public speaker. I'm just a man who built a cabin and learned some things from his father." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I came back from Vietnam in 1969, I was broken. The world didn't make sense to me anymore. I couldn't sleep in houses with thin walls. I couldn't trust systems I didn't understand. So I came out here, to this hill, and I built something I could trust." He gestured at the cabin behind him. "My father taught me how. His father taught him. Knowledge passed down through generations, father to son, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. That's how wisdom survives, not in books or computers, though those help too, but in the hands and hearts of people who care enough to learn." Derek looked at the crowd, at the faces of people who had been strangers a few months ago and were now something closer to family. What happened during the storm wasn't a miracle. It was just knowledge, applied when it mattered. And any one of you could have done the same thing if you'd known what I knew. He spread his hands. "That's what this center is for. So you can know, so your children can know, so that the next time the power goes out and the cold comes, and it will come, make no mistake, you'll be ready." The applause started slowly and built until it echoed across the valley. Derek stood there, uncomfortable with the attention, until Edna appeared at his side and took his hand. "You did good," she whispered. "We did good," he corrected. "All of us." 1 year later, the first anniversary of the storm fell on a Sunday in January. Derek woke at 5:30, as he always did, and moved through the cabin that was now never quite empty. Harold had built a small addition over the summer, a guest room for the visiting students who came from across the state to learn traditional building techniques. Susan had visited twice, Michael once, and both had promised to return with their families in the spring. The woodpile was full, the pantry was stocked, the well still worked. And in the field beside the cabin, the Bennett Resilience Center stood complete, a modest building constructed using the same techniques Derek had used 54 years ago. A double roof, thick walls, a massive wood stove at its heart. Derek dressed in the gray light and walked out onto the porch. The valley below